let's start this way. You talk about the word altruism. It doesn't, I was fascinated to see that it's not a word that has always been around. It's not a word you can find. It's not an ancient word, or at least the concept isn't necessarily an ancient concept. I might be wrong about that, but I think that's what I gathered from what you were talking about. Can you speak?
Right. It was invented in the 1800s by a philosopher named Auguste Comte. And he wanted to create a religion of humanity, a religion that had nothing to do with God. And altruism was a way for him to claim the moral high ground, basically, because religion, as strange as it might seem, although it gets you to be altruistic in terms of how you behave, that's not how it frames it. It frames it like you'll go to heaven if you're nice to others, which isn't really very altruistic psychologically. So that's one of the really interesting insights in the concept of altruism that I'm able to report in my book.
Yeah, you hear this all the time. People say, well, there is no such thing as true altruism because everybody does, ultimately they do things to their own end. Even if it's sacrifice, it's for their legacy, for their children, for their name to live on. At the end of the day, it's always about us. And you define altruism, or at least it is defined as someone who does something for the greater good, regardless of whether or not it benefits the individual doing the act. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. You make a very good argument and case study for the fact that whether or not it exists, altruistic behavior from an evolutionary perspective is ultimately the way to go. Fascinating where you talk about altruistic behavior. Selfish behavior works within a group. You might get most of the girls and most of the money, for example, if you behave in a very aggressive, selfish way. But selfish groups never beat altruistic groups. They don't have as many.
It's that simple. So let me just play that back. Number one, the idea that altruism does not exist, that everything is somehow selfish, that has a long tradition, and it's very familiar in everyday thought. Number two, evolutionists seem to contribute to that notion, that somehow evolution explains selfishness well and cannot explain anything that we could call genuine altruism. Number three, au contraire, evolution actually can explain altruism at face value in more or less the way that you've described, that if I would ask anyone to describe the morally perfect individual, they'd give a whole list of adjectives: loving, unselfish, brave, honorable, and all of that. And the opposite, of course, would be selfish, murderous, deceitful, and all of that. And that if you lock these different types of individuals in a Darwinian contest, like in a cage of sorts, then who wins? Well, within a cage, the selfish type wins. But if you have a bunch of cages, then we can get altruistic groups beating selfish groups. And so actually we have the means to explain how altruism, as anyone would define it, can evolve by a Darwinian process.